Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to decode a seriously intense and honestly often really confusing human experience. I mean, we've all heard the songs, right? We've read the books about that overwhelming, all-consuming crush, the kind that makes you feel like you are literally floating on air one minute and completely, utterly devastated the next. But what is actually happening inside your head when this hits you? Well, today, we're going to use hard science to break down the actual mechanics of this intense romantic infatuation.
Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to think back for a second. Recall a time when a crush didn't just feel like a nice, warm, fuzzy emotion, but felt like it completely hijacked your brain. A time when you could barely function, and that line between healthy affection and absolute obsession just vanished. You probably asked yourself, am I just crazy in love? Well, science asks a slightly different question. Is it love, or is it limerence?
To get to the bottom of that, we have to look at the groundbreaking work of psychologist Dorothy Tennov. Back in the 60s and 70s, she interviewed over 500 people about their experiences with love. And through all this research, she realized that what a lot of people were calling being madly in love was actually a very specific, totally involuntary, and overwhelming cognitive state. So in 1979, she coined the term limerence to describe it. She wanted to draw a massive line in the sand between this crazy roller coaster state of profound infatuation and actual healthy companionate love. Because neurologically, they're completely different events.
All right, Section 1, the symptoms of limerence.
Let's break down what this condition actually looks and feels like when you're in the thick of it. What's absolutely fascinating here is just how clinical and consistent these symptoms are across the board. When you're in a state of limerence, the person you desire, who is known clinically as the limerent object or LO, they essentially become a black hole of attraction. You get these intrusive, relentless thoughts about them that you literally cannot turn off. Your entire mood becomes dependent on their actions, like a text back, absolute euphoria, silence, complete despair. There's this intense, paralyzing fear of rejection. Sufferers even report a literal physical aching right in the center of their chest. And the craziest part? These feelings usually intensify when there are barriers or adversity in the way.
Now, if this sounds painfully familiar, let me assure you, you are definitely not alone. Take a look at this survey data from neuroscientist Tom Bellamy. A massive 64% of respondents said they've experienced limerence at least once. It is so common. But what's really striking, and maybe a little scary, is that 32% found the experience so distressingly debilitating that it actually made it hard to enjoy life. This really validates just how powerfully disruptive this mental state is. It is not just some silly crush. It's a major psychological event. So you gotta wonder, why does the limerent object seem so flawlessly perfect to us? Why do we put them on such an impossibly high pedestal?
Which brings us to Section 2, the illusion of crystallization.
The psychological concept of crystallization is wild, and it actually traces all the way back to 1821 from a metaphor by the French writer Stendhal. He described taking a totally bare, ordinary tree branch and throwing it down into a salt mine. If you pull it out a few months later, it's completely covered in these shimmering salt crystals. It transforms this boring, mundane piece of wood into an object of dazzling beauty. And in limerence, our brains do this exact same thing to a person. We dress up an ordinary, flawed human being in shimmering, idealized perfection.
Dorothy Tennov hit the nail right on the head with how this plays out in real life. She said that limerence gives you a remarkable ability to emphasize what is truly admirable in LO and to avoid dwelling on the negative, meaning crystallization literally forces our brains to ignore their flaws. We might even look at their toxic traits and find them weirdly attractive, or we make endless excuses for their bad behavior. This mental filter completely blinds us to reality, and it locks us into a fantasy that we've essentially built ourselves. So we know the psychology. But what is physically going on inside your head?
Let's look under the hood. Section 3. Dopamine and the brain. Let's pivot from the psychology to the hard neuroscience driving all these obsessive feelings. When scientists, like biological anthropologist Helen Fisher, put people who had quote-unquote just fallen madly in love into fMRI scanners, they saw something unbelievable. Just looking at a photo of their crush caused massive activation in this specific region of the midbrain called the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA. Now, the VTA is a core part of your brain's reward system. It's basically a dopamine-producing factory. It completely floods your brain with dopamine, and it ties the image of that person directly to your most primal drives and motivations.
To really grasp what that dopamine flood does to you, we have to look at two very distinct neurological concepts, liking versus wanting. Liking is about actual hedonic pleasure. It uses opiate receptors and it's associated with calmness and secure, healthy attachment. Wanting, on the other hand, is entirely dopamine-driven. It creates what neuroscientists call incentive salience. It turns the limerent object into this motivational magnet that absolutely demands your attention, creating a state of intense craving. Limerence isn't even necessarily about liking the person, it's just a massive, overwhelming spike in wanting. But what triggers that dopamine system to just spiral out of control?
Section 4. The slot machine effect.
Let's look at the actual environmental triggers that pour gasoline on this dopamine fire. Have you ever found yourself agonizingly overanalyzing a mixed message? You know, a text that was just a little colder than usual, followed by a sudden burst of warmth after days of total silence. You've got to ask yourself, why does that uncertainty fuel the fire? Well, science shows that situational uncertainty, mixed signals, barriers, you name it, is practically required for limerence to survive and grow.
So the crucial point here is understanding how dopamine actually handles our expectations. See, dopamine doesn't just reward us for getting what we want. It uses a mechanism called reward prediction error. It basically encodes whether a reward is better than, equal to, or worse than what we expected. When a reward is entirely unexpected, like a random sweet text from your crush, right when you thought they were ignoring you, the dopamine spike is absolutely massive. The unpredictability itself is what keeps the brain hooked.
And this creates a really powerful loop known as intermittent reinforcement. This is literally the exact same psychological mechanism that makes pulling the lever on a slot machine so dangerously addictive. Think about it. If a slot machine paid out exactly $1 every single time you pulled it, the exhilarating high would vanish immediately. It'd be totally boring. The thrill comes from not knowing when it's going to hit. Getting unpredictable breadcrumbs of attention from a limerent object acts exactly like that slot machine, creating a fiercely addictive, compulsive behavioral loop.
Section 5. A person addiction.
This brings us to a harsh but honestly deeply validating truth for anyone who's been through this. The scientific literature increasingly views the early stages of this state as a literal behavioral addiction. The only difference is the substance you're craving isn't a chemical, it's a human being. Just look at the addiction cycle of limerence here. In the early stage, you're driven by positive reinforcement. You get the intoxication, the ecstasy, those vivid, beautiful daydreams. You are chasing the high. But in the later stages, especially if they don't like you back, it shifts entirely to negative reinforcement. You become lovesick. You aren't chasing a high anymore. You are just compulsively seeking their attention to avoid the painful withdrawal symptoms of separation. The intrusive thinking becomes a full-blown compulsion, functioning super similarly to OCD.
Okay, so how do we fix it? Section 6. Breaking the limerent cycle.
With all this crazy neurochemistry working against us, how do we actually escape? Let's transition from the diagnosis to the cure and look at a structured way out of this trap. Dorothy Tenno found there are basically 3 main ways a limerent episode concludes. First, all hope of reciprocation gets completely extinguished through a clear, unambiguous rejection. Hope is the fuel, right? Kill the hope, the fire dies. Second, an actual relationship begins, and consistent reciprocation leads to habituation. Basically, true love requires that frantic dopamine rush to eventually fade into a calm, secure attachment. Or third, the limerent feelings just magically transfer to a completely new person and the cycle starts all over again.
But what if you want to actively hack your own brain and break those intrusive thoughts yourself? Neuroscientist Tom Bellamy recommends this awesome active deprogramming tool called the Daymare strategy. Here's how it works. When you catch your brain automatically slipping into a really rewarding romantic daydream about your crush, you deliberately spoil the reward. You force the fantasy to end in a nightmare. Picture them being incredibly rude to a waiter, or imagine them chewing with their mouth wide open, whatever gives you the ick. By doing this repeatedly, you accelerate the overriding of those memories, linking that person to a dopamine reward. You are literally training your brain to stop viewing them as the ultimate prize.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a tremendous amount of fascinating ground today, really dissecting the intense neurochemistry and the psychology behind our most overwhelming crushes. But before we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, really provocative question to ponder. When you look back at your past heartbreaks, the ones that truly, deeply devastated you, was it truly lost love, or were you just going through a severe dopamine withdrawal? Empowering yourself with this neuroscience lets you totally reevaluate your past and take back control of your future. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the world around you.